Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited. So just a little bit of background where I'm coming from. So I'm a philosopher. I am a philosopher of the worst kind. I'm a metaphysician. And I'm a metaphysician of the worst kind. I'm a meta-metaphysician. What I'm doing here is largely related to that and my tendency to abstract and see things at this meta level. So I'm hoping that by applying this to Twain, it could help clarify some debates and disagreements that I've seen in Twain scholarship and interpretation, as well as it does in philosophy more generally. Okay, so what I was using as my piece is Twain's depiction of the devil or Satan, particularly in his later works, his more philosophical works, The Mysterious Stranger, number 44, and Letters from Earth. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Hopefully you're familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about. In the case of The Mysterious Stranger, in the text, the audience is presented with a clash in morality between the morality that the devil subscribes to, or Satan, a type of maybe morality, and human morality. So there's the concept of good as used by the humans in the novel, or in the narrative, in the story, and then how the devil perceives what's good. And so there's the case of the old woman whose child dies and she's unable to bury him, and the humans at Theodore and Nicholas ask Satan, well, can you please help her? Can you improve her life? Right? They're very upset at the way her life is going. They want to improve it. And so Satan says, well, first, basically Satan increases her life, speeds up her life by 3 minutes, and she immediately dies. And so the idea is Satan's like, okay, I will make her life better. I will end it abruptly because life is misery, and so the best thing for a human, as we know from Silenus, is to die young, or to not be born at all and then to die young. And so Satan's very much the sort of Silenus character in that case. And so Satan says, what you're thinking is strictly human-like, the desire for well-being. That's to say, foolish. The woman is advantaged. Die when she might, she would go to heaven. By this prompt death, she gets 29 years more of heaven than she is entitled to and escapes 29 years of misery here. Right, so it's often presented as a very pessimistic, pessimistic story. Twain himself didn't want it released during his lifetime. It has nihilistic overtones. So what's going on here? Does Twain really think there's no morality, everything's determined? How do we make sense of what the devil, Satan, is saying here, what Twain really thinks, what we're supposed to take away from this? And in the philosophy of meta-ethics, philosophy of ethics, I think Satan's presenting what is called an error theory, which is to say that morality is categorically mistaken, human morality. It's a product of our limited understanding. If we had sort of Satan, God's eye view, we would agree with Satan that the best thing for a human is to never be born or to die young. And so humans, as presented, this is error theory more generally, as well as how I think it's presented in like The Mysterious Stranger, as well as in philosophy, like with Kant. Humans generally assume that the point of a moral judgment is to track objective features of the world. Moral value is thus mind independent, it's universal, it's absolute. Right? It's not questionable, it's not up to you in this way. It's something, beyond us, it's authoritative on us. Right? We are responsible. And Satan reveals that the universe is governed by natural laws, or determined, which entails that human moral concepts are a product of our limited understanding, right? And as Theodore says, it is as Satan said, we do not know good fortune from bad, and we're always mistaking one for the other, right? So there's this skepticism about, right, our very moral vocabulary. And so my claim is that instead of interpreting this as a first-order view, as an error theory, we should understand Twain as engaging in a type of meta-ethical inquiry, particularly a type that is related to like the aphoristic style that has been talked about, parables, Wittgensteinian exercises, the idea being that it's essential for the audience to work out the normative implications of what's being presented. So Twain's work often investigate the function or point of a moral, social, religious practice or vocabulary, and that's like a core move that I want to make, is a shift to understanding what's the function or the point of the concept or the practice, rather than what it is, and how that changes the questions that we ask. Specifically, Twain uses the figure of Satan to encourage readers to adopt an unfamiliar perspective on familiar commitments, in this case, moral commitments and values, and thus engaging in a form of meta-ethical inquiry, the audience themselves, right, consciously or not, because now you're reflecting on, okay, well, what do I mean when I use the word good? Do I think that, you know, it's possible to change the course of events? Or if I went in the past, could I change it? If you've seen the movie with Ashton Kutcher called The Butterfly Effect, it kind of explores a similar issue, where, you know, is it possible to change the course of history, or are things determined? Right, so by asking ourselves this question, you know, encouraged by the text, we are now ourselves doing a type of ethical theory, right? Even though we're not, you know, there's not a lot of theoretical baggage being thrown at us when we're doing it. So in that sense, I feel it's like more authentic as well. Yeah, I think it's a better way of doing philosophy. So what do I mean when I say meta-ethics? Inquiry into the features of our moral statements, practices, and concepts. So take the statement, murder is wrong. Meta-ethics asks, okay, well, how can I know if that's true? Is that the sort of thing that can be true or false? If so, how can I know if it's true or false? What evidence does it counts for or against? Is morality part of the natural world? Is it something that science can help us understand? How do we come to find out? Knowledge, facts, evidence about it. Semantic, so again, our language, what's the truth conditions for our moral statements? What makes them true? Are they in the business of describing or representing what is out there in the world? So that'll be my move. I think Twain helps us see that there are more functions of language beyond describing what is true. And then metaphysical, is moral value mind dependent, is it socially constructed, is it natural? Those are meta-ethical questions. And I think in many ways what Satan presents kind of encourages us to start asking these sorts of questions, right? Satan says, right, they're categorically false when they are uttered from when humans utter moral concepts. And then this is the problem that leads to the aesthetics of the unfinished and Wittgenstein and maybe Nietzsche losing his mind, I don't know, but there's an inherent vice in trying to do meta-ethics or meta-metaphysics or meta-philosophy and or meta-philosophy, which is to say, like, what is the status of the statements that we're making about the moral statements? So this is where now I'm getting all abstract, but this ends up causing problems if you think that what you're doing when you're talking about moral statements is describing them, because then we just have the same problem going again. Okay, well now what makes a meta-ethical statement true? Is a meta-ethical statement in the business of describing? So on and so forth. So this is a problem that is not unique to meta-ethics, it's also found in like meta-metaphysics. So when a philosopher says, the essence of something, is its formal properties, well, what makes that true? So this is all to step back and to ask, okay, well, what are we doing when we do philosophy or fiction or moral criticism, critique, social political critique? And a traditional philosophical inquiry is taken to be discovering what is really true, the essence of something, like Aristotle is maybe a canonical example of this. And so philosophical vocabulary is descriptive. It's modeled after scientific explanation, mathematical explanation. So philosophers really want to be scientists. And part of my thing, inspired by Rorty, is we need to be artists and literary critics and those things and the like. So Amy Thomason, a philosopher, metaphysician, and aesthetician, she's recently done work on offering a different model of philosophy where it isn't on this. She contrasts it from the discovery model to what she calls the creation model, where the idea is philosophy is not always in the business of doing what science is doing, particularly when we're concerned with features of reality that the sciences do not and potentially cannot investigate because they're not empirically observable. So aesthetic features, modal features, to say it's like possible that my phone could break, what am I saying there? Aesthetic features. For her, she began her work with fictional characters. So, there seems to be truths about Sherlock Holmes. How does that work, since what makes statements about Sherlock Holmes true is going to be different from what makes statements about the modal properties of my phone true. So in that sense, this inherent vice that I'm talking about when you're trying to go to the second order level is found in any sort of philosophical activity. So if Satan was giving us a traditional explanation, then we'd come up with all these issues of, okay, well, how is this true? Are we really determined? Now we can't be free. Why have any morality? And so that becomes this undermining of the very possibility of genuine like moral progress or moral concepts. So how can we successfully describe them without first like securing the right evidence? So what I want to say is we do fiction. And what we could understand Twain is doing is something similar to philosophers that engage what's called genealogical inquiry. So that's a type of quasi-fictional explanation or story that offers an alternative account of the origin, point, function, or purpose of a practice or concept that reveals how it could be radically different than what we think. But it's not necessarily, it's not describing what's actually true about the practice. It's offering you something that serves almost as a corrective to compare your current commitments with and realize, oh, like deflate them or maybe inflate them depending on how it relates. So there's like no one right way that you engage with a genealogy, which makes it also riskier, as you might know from how Nietzsche's, in particular, genealogy and metaethical inquiries have been exploited and manipulated by bad actors. So that's a thing I'm not talking about here, but it is in here as well, that there's a risk associated. But the function of it is to make the familiar unfamiliar, right? To think, okay, what is it? What do I think now about my moral values if it is the case that they're a product of resentment? What when I say, oh, Kim Kardashian, she shouldn't be flying on the private plane, what I'm really saying is I wish I could fly on that private plane, right? So what do I do with that, right? It's very sort of practical as well. And so why genealogy? I think it's well suited for inquiries where the target is a norm-governed practice, because norm-governed practices are sort of insulated. You can't criticize a deontologist from a Humean perspective, because your antecedent commitments of when you use the word good are going to be like the human and Satan. Like you use it incompatibly. You're using the same word to talk about different things. And so one thing you can do instead, if that's what you're aiming at, that's what you want to target, like Twain does, is to offer this alternative account of the point or the purpose or the origin that causes people to adopt a different attitude or perspective rather than giving them facts and information about what's true. So it's a sort of subtle move to say, like, no, I'm not giving you evidence for what is true, and that's why you should change your mind. I'm offering you an alternative possibility that then you can use as a tool and eventually, hopefully, change your mind. But the mind-changing aspect isn't within the actual account. It's implicit. So it's very much also like the aphorisms. Again, the audience has to work out the implications. If morality comes from resentment, what does that entail? And that depends on what you think morality is. And so the point of a genealogical account is to not give you evidence or factual information. It's not operating like a traditional argument, right? Premise, 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 conclusion. It's premise, premise, implicit, and premise. You draw the conclusion. And if moral vocabulary is a product of our limited understanding, as presented in The Mysterious Stranger, then we ought to lower our confidence in our moral judgments, both towards ourselves and towards others. And this is something you could do, I think, with Nietzsche as well, where you can read it pessimistically and nihilistically, or you can read it sort of compassionately. And if I had more time, I would relate to Thomas Nagel's notion of moral luck, which is very similar to, I think, how Twain presents this clash between an objective perspective, an all-seeing perspective, and a human perspective, where they're incompatible, the two judgments of I can't help but feel guilty that I hit the dog, but I obviously didn't control the dog being there. I didn't make the dog be there, so I'm, in a sense, not responsible, yet I can't help but feel responsible. And so Nagel's sort of conclusion after exploring this with moral luck isn't like, well, screw morality. It's, well, now I need to think harder and differently about the role of morality and social practices and my assumptions about responsibility and control. Like in the case of criminal justice or our punishment system. So it's an increase in humility and compassion rather than pessimism. And it ideally, once we recognize what we're doing and it's a genealogy rather than a scientific observation, then we're less likely to draw these metaphysical commitment and these metaphysical conclusions that he's really saying the world is determined and so we can't have morality, we can't have free will. Because you're not entitled to make that you're not entitled to make that to draw that inference from like a parable, right? Parables, when we engage with a parable, we don't think like it's giving us facts about the world, right? So that's what I'm saying. Understand it closer, continuous with parables, and jokes. So in that way, his later works are often not treated as are considered funny, but I think they actually are still using the formal properties of humor in this really interesting way, and that's like how we could potentially understand types of philosophical methodology, is this interactive and conditional nature. Yeah, I even added aphorism after Click's talk, because there's something unique about these forms of investigation in that they don't give us new information, but they, as Wittgenstein would say, serve as like reminders. And so it's like, it has to do with an internal self-reflective activity rather than, again, giving you more information as what's true or false. But it's riskier because of that. And this, I think Twain's methods place him in, like, strongly in a tradition of meta-philosophical analyses, like those found in some other 19th century thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Marx, and the later Wittgenstein, and could serve as somebody that can participate in these discussions about how we can do philosophy, what we're doing when we do philosophy, and how fiction and art and literature is doing philosophy, once we understand what philosophy can and can't do. So yeah, thank you.